Cuba. Huh. It's crazy, right? The whole island plunged into darkness. Again.
Yeah, this is the fourth time in 6 months that we're seeing this happen. And it's not just a little blip, it's the entire country.
The whole island blackout. It's wild. So we've got some fascinating material to dive into today to really get a grip on what's going on. We've got some firsthand accounts from folks on the ground, plus a pretty in-depth analysis of the larger energy crisis that's gripping the country.
Yeah, definitely a lot to unpack here.
Exactly. Our mission today is to go beyond the headlines, right? To understand why these blackouts keep happening and what they really mean for the future of Cuba.
Right, because on the surface, it's just like, oh, power's out again, but there's obviously way more to it than that.
Way more, you're right. So let's jump in. The latest blackout, this one started on Friday, March 14th, 2025. And, we're talking everything down. Hospitals, homes, shops, government buildings, the whole 9 yards.
It's pretty shocking, the scale of it. A whole nation just stopping.
Yeah, I know. And what really got me was, by the end of Saturday, there were still tons of places without power. Can you imagine, food spoiling, vaccines going bad?
Yeah.
I mean, it's chaotic.
It's not just an inconvenience at that point, right? It becomes a public health crisis. People needing medication that needs to be refrigerated.
Oh, absolutely. And the hospitals. I read this account from Cienfuegos where the entire hospital was completely dark. I mean, that's scary stuff. And what really struck me was the fact that hotels and some government facilities, they had power.
Yeah. That definitely raises some eyebrows, right, when you see that kind of discrepancy. Who gets priority in a situation like this?
It's a huge question. It makes you think this isn't just about a technical fault in the power grid. This is about, a systemic problem in how resources are allocated.
For sure. And, we can't ignore the fact that this is the fourth major blackout in less than 6 months. There's definitely a pattern emerging here. It's getting worse, not better.
Right. It's like a runaway train.
Yeah.
And, that article mentioned the incident back in February where schools and workplaces were shut down because of this huge power generation deficit. I think it was over 50%, which is...
That's insane. And when you look at the explanations being offered, technically speaking, Cuba relies heavily on these thermoelectric plants for power generation. So the core issue is fuel, oil, petroleum. They need it to run these plants.
Makes sense. But here's the thing, right? Cuba doesn't exactly have significant domestic oil production. So they're incredibly dependent on imports, which of course require U.S. dollars.
Which are scarce, especially with the reduced aid from Venezuela, which was a major oil supplier historically.
Exactly. And then on top of that, you've got the U.S. sanctions hitting Chevron's operations in Venezuela, making things even tighter. So it's this perfect storm of technical issues colliding with geopolitics.
It's a mess. And it goes even deeper than that, to be honest, because one of the sources you shared from the Vision Libertaria, it presents a really interesting perspective, the problem of economic calculation.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Lay it on me. What's that all about?
So the theory, it comes from this economist, Ludwig von Mises, back in 1921. And he argues that without a free market, you can't have efficient allocation of resources.
Okay, why not?
Because prices are either manipulated or non-existent. They don't reflect real supply and demand. So decisions about what to produce, how much, where it goes, it's all distorted.
Interesting. So how does that apply to what's going on in Cuba specifically?
Well, the argument is that in a communist system like Cuba's, these crucial economic decisions, they're often driven by political interests rather than, by actual economic signals.
Right. So you're saying, instead of letting the market figure out how to distribute resources most efficiently, the government steps in and makes those calls. But
those calls might be based on what's politically expedient or ideologically aligned, but not necessarily what's economically sound.
Got it. And over time, this leads to widespread inefficiency.
Exactly. And that's where this quote comes in. O comunismo é isso daí. Communism is this, pointing to the dark cities and hospitals. Pretty powerful, right? Suggesting these blackouts are a symptom of a fundamentally flawed system.
Yeah, that's a pretty bold statement.
Yeah.
And they even go on to draw a parallel with the collapse of the Soviet Union back in 1990. This idea that this kind of long-term economic inefficiency, it eventually leads to systemic failure.
Right. It's not sustainable. And they even mention this idea of a typical lifespan for communist regimes, something like 70 years. And Cuba, well, they're getting pretty close to that mark.
Wow. That's a sobering thought. It makes you think about the long-term viability of their current model. And, it brings us back to that stark inequality that the sources highlight, the contrast between the general population struggling without power And the hotels, humming along, business as usual.
Yeah, it's a pretty striking juxtaposition, the way they describe it. Like these tourists staying in these nice hotels with these well-stocked supermarkets just for them. And then you have Cuban residents who can't even enter those places. It's like two different realities existing side by side.
It's surreal, like a tale of two cities. And the explanation they offer is fascinating, right? They say this prioritization of tourism, it's driven by this desperate need for foreign currency. Like it's become a survival mechanism for the regime.
Right, because tourism brings in those precious U.S. dollars that they so desperately need.
But, as they point out, there's a real human cost to this strategy, because essential services, like hospitals, are bearing the brunt of this. Which is ironic, right? Given Cuba's long-standing reputation for its healthcare system.
Yeah, and they even question that reputation in one of the excerpts.
Oh, yeah. Like maybe those positive social indicators, the education stats, the healthcare numbers, they're suggesting those might be inflated.
Right, because there's a lack of independent oversight. There's no real opposition to challenge the official narrative or to independently verify the data.
And they use this phrase, martelando numero, hammering the numbers. Which implies data manipulation.
It's definitely a red flag. It makes you question how much you can trust the official information coming out of a system like that. And it directly challenges that official narrative, which, unsurprisingly, blames external factors, the U.S. embargo primarily.
Which is, let's be honest, kind of a classic move, right? When things go wrong, blame outside forces.
Absolutely. Scapegoating is a time-honored political tactic.
But even though the sources acknowledge the embargo, they also offer a counterargument. They point out that food and medicine, they're exempt from the embargo.
Right, so it's not like the U.S. is completely cutting off all essential supplies.
Exactly. And they compare Cuba to other countries facing difficulties. And it does suggest that the embargo, while impactful, isn't the sole cause or even necessarily the primary driver of these problems.
Right, because other countries manage to function, even thrive, under challenging circumstances.
And that example they give of the high cost of basic goods like eggs compared to the minimum wage, that really illustrates the depth of the internal economic issues.
Definitely. They're trying to show that even without the embargo, there are fundamental flaws in how the Cuban economy is structured.
Okay, so let's shift gears a bit. Let's talk about what actually keeping Cuba afloat, at least for now. Because despite all these challenges, they're still functioning in some capacity.
Barely. And the sources point to a couple of key factors. Tourism, as we discussed, but it's clearly limited in its ability to address the widespread poverty.
Yeah, those dollars aren't trickling down to the average Cuban. So what else is there?
Remittances, money sent back home by Cubans living abroad, especially in Miami.
Right, and they argue that without this influx of foreign currency, Cuba would probably have already collapsed.
Exactly. They describe remittances as a temporary lifeline. A muleta, a crutch.
A crutch, that's a really apt metaphor.
Right. It's keeping them upright, but it's not a long-term solution. It's not sustainable development.
It's survival mode.
Yeah.
And the broader implications of this situation, well, they're pretty concerning.
They are. They compare Cuba to Venezuela, but even worse, like Venezuela Pirata. And there's this worry that other nations might be heading down a similar path in terms of democratic processes.
Yeah, it's that slippery slope argument.
Exactly. And they even predict the eventual collapse of the Cuban regime. The quote is, "Uma hora vai que a gente não tá longe disto não." Like, one day it will fall, and we're not far from that.
Wow. So what's the solution, according to these critics? What needs to happen?
They advocate for a pretty fundamental shift to a capitalist model with private property and free markets.
A complete overhaul.
Yeah. They argue that only by embracing market mechanisms can Cuba hope to achieve long-term economic stability, and they point to Cuba's agricultural potential. They say that historically, Cuba had a strong agricultural sector, that, they could really leverage that.
It's interesting, right? Because it suggests that there's this untapped potential if only the system would allow it to flourish.
Right. It's about removing the shackles, so to speak. But, in the interest of fairness, we should at least acknowledge the alternative perspective, even though it's not heavily emphasized in these particular sources.
Of course. Lay it on me.
It's the argument that the U.S. embargo, it severely restricts Cuba's ability to manage its resources effectively and to engage in international trade.
Right. So from that perspective, the embargo itself is the biggest obstacle to their economic development.
Exactly. So it's a complex picture, for sure.
It is. So let's wrap this up. What's the takeaway here? The energy crisis in Cuba, it's multi-layered, right?
Yeah.
It's not just about a power plant going offline. It's about a complex interplay of technical issues, deep-rooted systemic economic problems, and the undeniable influence of geopolitics.
Right. And all of that's leading to significant hardship and really stark inequality for the Cuban people.
Exactly. And the central question that these sources raise, it boils down to this. Are we witnessing a fundamental failure of a specific political and economic system? Or is this primarily the result of external pressures and interventions?
And based on the sources we've looked at, the analysis seems to lean heavily towards the former, that this is an internal problem more than anything else.
Right. So for all of you listening out there, consider these different perspectives. What resonates with you as the most significant factor? And what do you think the long-term implications of this ongoing crisis might be, not just for Cuba, but potentially for other nations facing similar challenges?
Because, given Cuba's long and complex history and its current convergence of economic and political challenges, well, it makes you wonder, what fundamental changes would truly be needed beyond just restoring the power grid to ensure a stable and equitable future for its people?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Thanks for joining us in this deep dive, everyone. Until next time, keep those critical thinking caps on.